Alright guys, William here back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another part of my ranking of every Australian Survivor player, this being part 2, where in part 1 I ranked players number 201 to 151, where here we were doing the next 50 of 150 to 101. So again, might as well just jump right into it. At number 150, we're moving on to a player that ends up being a pretty expendable player in the game, someone that didn't really seem to have many connections and many alliances, didn't have anyone that really wanted to keep them around, though also made it fairly deep into the game, so makes him a bit tougher to rank. But at 150, I'm moving on to Hannah from Champs vs. Contenders 2, and Hannah's a player that, again, was largely just kind of there for a lot of the season. Didn't seem to have any particularly close allies in the game. Again, seemingly was with Sarah and Sam, though once they get blindsided at the swap, she's just kind of on the bottom and eventually gets taken out in a very wonky circumstance, to be fair. I mean, she is taken out as the backup to David after he plays the idol, which again, maybe there's at least some level of credit to be given to her there for her not being the primary target. But even then, again, she was just a largely expendable figure from the rest of her tribe mates, to where they decided to end up going for her over Luke. And again, I think that's a spot where Hannah doesn't do that much actively wrong, but that's because she doesn't really do much actively at all. And all things considered, I feel like it was easy to leave her off here at number 150. Now number 49, similar thing, but for someone that has actually played twice somehow. And we have Stevie from Champs vs. Contenders 2 and Here's His Villains. And Stevie's a player that, truth be told, would be very low on this list if it was just his first appearance, where Stevie was someone that was on the bottom from the very beginning, and obviously, again, bias has played a factor into that. I mean, the fact that he's very different than the rest of his tribe definitely played a factor, though even then, again, it's a spot where he was on the bottom. He did do some decent work in building bonds with the men, only for it to actually piss off the women, to where they voted him out anyway. To where, again, not a particularly good game his first time around, but his second game also wasn't that good, but it did actually have him making it deeper into the game, and having some people that did want to keep him around, where, again, he had someone like a Simon that did want to keep him. He had George that obviously picked him up as a number, and almost took him to the merge. And even then, in that tribal where he goes home, I feel like that was a very weird circumstance, which, I mean, to be fair, still definitely a fault on him for not having the connections with Liz and Shawnee to make them willing to take him to the merge. But still a spot where, had they not gone so gung-ho over wanting to keep Flick around, Stevie probably makes it fairly deep into the season, with, again, no one really targeting him coming into the merge. And really outside that, I do feel like Stevie's just someone that is almost never going to win the game, but is someone that definitely has longevity as someone's loyal ally to keep around, though ultimately, again, still a fairly lackluster player here. So again, I think a step above Hannah, I guess. So again, he's here at 149. Number 148, we have a player that also was kind of on the bottom for most of their run, but I think at least had sprinkles of decent gameplay towards the end, and that player is Tegan from AE 2016. And Tegan is a player that was really on the bottom for her entire season. I mean, she is someone that was instantly on the bottom of her original tribe, where she was tied to Nick, and her and Nick were blindsided at the first vote. So again, she was not well positioned early on. Now she does end up swapping over into a very unfortunate circumstance where she's on the bottom alongside Nick, and she then proceeds to be the first to go from that swap tribe, though I actually don't feel like there's that much actively bad play from her there, where I actually feel like there was some decent play from her. The fact that she was able to bond with the likes of Flick and Brooke and had them consider keeping her around. Also the fact that she was taken out kind of as a backup target, where the main intention of that vote was to flush out Kylie's idol, and obviously, again, Kylie plays it, and they kind of knew she was going to play it, but still, it's a spot where she was not the primary target, where had Kylie not played her idol, I do think it is likely that Tegan ends up staying. So again, I think those are minor credits to give her here, especially considering, again, it was a position where she was swap screwed to begin with, where, again, I think it's a bit of a tough game because, I don't think she was playing particularly well before the swap, but I do think once she was swapped, I do think she actually plays fairly decently. So again, that's enough to put her here at 148. Now 147, moving on to the player I just mentioned, we're moving on to Kylie from AE 2016. I believe Kylie is the first post-merger I'm talking about here. And really a lot of that comes from the fact that Kylie is just someone that probably shouldn't have made the merge. I mean, she's someone that was just kind of on the bottom of her original tribe from the very beginning. Seemingly was kept around for physical strength on the offset, and then obviously end up finding an idol, and end up, again, needing that idol down the road. But even then, was just, again, on the bottom for most of the season. She obviously doesn't end up going to tribal for a good chunk of the pre-merge, because she ends up being put on the OP Sanapu tribe, and through that, she's, again, still on the bottom of the pecking order, but just not going to tribal for forever. And then she eventually makes the merge, where obviously, again, there's 2 people to easily take out as part of a Bagonging, and then after that, she survives over Nick, but then immediately goes out after that, where, again, she just kind of rides with this majority that she's at the bottom of. And again, it's a very frustrating game here. It's one that, again, I just don't really feel like there's that much to actively praise from her game because she's just simply on the bottom and doesn't really do anything about it. And obviously, again, it is a difficult spot to get out of to begin with, but again, she's just not a capable enough player to get out of that position. And I do feel like she's just a player that doesn't really seem to be playing the game that actively, just kind of going along with people that she gels with and just kind of being a follower to them, to where ultimately, again, I don't think she's that good of a player. She's here at 147. And 146, another post-merger that shouldn't have been a post-merger. We have Mel from Blood versus Water. And Mel's another one here that was saved by a non-elimination twist. She was someone that was meant to be going home. Mind you, at the last vote before the merge, but it was a position where they end up having that twist where she had a chance at fire making against Ben, and she obviously wins that. So again, credit to her for that, I guess. But really, outside that, again, she's just really on the bottom and kind of aloof to her position, seemingly for a lot of it, where it seemed like she really did not realize just how on the bottom she was, where she was blindsided by her eventual vote off, and also in the spot where it never really felt like she had any traction in the game. Like, obviously, she is eventually voted out after the merge in what seemed like a very easy vote for most people involved, where for some reason they did look at her as a bigger threat over her sister, and they obviously need to split the two up. But again, she's just someone that didn't really do much across the game. She really just felt like a follower for a lot of the game and just was, again, kind of on the bottom for a lot of the game. And even then, again, shouldn't have really even made the merge in the spot that she did, to where ultimately, again, I do think it is a fairly faulty game here. So I'm putting her at 146. Now 145, we're moving on to a grouping of players here all in a row of players that end up being medevaced fairly early into the game. And I mean, technically this one's not technically a medevac, but obviously adjacent. And that player is Alec Frost from Blood versus Water. And Alex is just someone I just don't know what to do with. I mean, there's not really much to really gauge from his game. We never really got to see many of the inner workings of his game. We never really saw who he was particularly close to. And again, who knows his real longevity further into the season. Though that being said, it did seem like people wanted him to go, and it did seem like people genuinely liked him, to where, again, I think he deserves to be this high simply because, again, he was never really a target despite how sick he was, and people actively didn't want him to quit the game and wanted him around, where, again, at least that's a credit to something. Now, again, I just simply don't know what his long-term potential was, to where, again, I wouldn't necessarily put him higher than this. Though I think, again, being above against some of these more actively bad players, especially ones with very little merit to them, again, I think it's a decent spot to leave Alex here. So again, he's at 145. Now 144, moving on to similar things. Someone medevac from the game, had some potential in the game, and that player is Jenna from Champs Contenders 1. And Jenna's a weird player here because, yeah, she was medevac from the game and was medevac in a position where she was seemingly in a good position, though her group eventually ends up crumbling pretty soon after that, to where it kind of makes me question, like, how much potential did she really have, where she was aligned with the likes of Heath and Tegan. And again, they seem to be in this major swing position at the point that she was taken out of the game, though it ends up being a position that ends up really crumbling after she leaves, where it does lead to Tegan and Heath being on the outs. And well, obviously there's wonkiness after that, but again, it does lead to me questioning, like, how well positioned would Jenna have really been had she stayed, which obviously, again, for all we know, that her with Tegan and Heath would have been able to avoid being flipped on. Though, again, it's just a spot where I think there's some unknowns here, but again, I at least know where her game was a bit more than someone like Alex, where I really just don't know who he was connected with. She at least had an alliance here, though I think those question marks do put her below the next person we'll be talking about. So again, she's here at 144. Now 143, again, the last medevac player we're talking about in a row here. We're moving on to Zen from Brains of Brawn 2. And Zen is a weird one because I don't really know how much faith I necessarily have in Zen as a player. I think what we saw of him was just kind of a mess, like how he wanted to try to work with Nash and instantly flipped on Nash and tried to like pretend that he was working with him. And it's like, all that was just kind of sloppy play. Though obviously never went back on him, where it didn't seem like a spot where he was in any particular danger. And I think that's something about Zen that's a bit tough to really gauge here, is that by the time he leaves, he does seem to be pretty revered by his tribe. It didn't seem like he was in any danger of going out, along with also having some pretty strong connections, where he really seemed to be this like kind of glue to this like Nash side of things, where again, he had this like connection with PT seemingly the real person that was like kind of running that side of the game, also having connections to the other side. And again, I think Zen is someone that could theoretically be well positioned. The thing is, like, I just don't, again, fully know exactly where his game stood. And I suspect if he were to stay the entire season, it would eventually fall back on him. Though, again, we never really got to see that. And again, in comparison to Jenna, where we know where she was in the game, but again, it was a spot where her alliance gets immediately flipped on. I feel like Zen probably had a lot more short-term security. So again, I put him here at number 143. Now 142, moving on to players now that had at least some backing in the game, had some alliances, though still not the cleanest players in the world. At 142, though, we're going to be starting it off with Georgia from Brains vs. Brawn. And Georgia's someone that is a little tough to gauge because I do feel like there was an initial part of her game that was decent in the sense that she was aligned with Joey. It did seem like her group had some power in the game, though at the same time, obviously, it was flipped on by the time of the swap. And while she ends up getting a pretty bad swap to where from that point on she's on the bottom, she was, again, already kind of on the bottom of her original tribe also. While there was a point where her alliance was in power, it is a position here where she really spends a lot of the back portion of her game on the bottom, which again, I don't know how much fault necessarily to give to her for the post-swap of it all at least, but even then, she was a large expendable number, and obviously, again, there was the fact that she was sick, even had the sick day involved there to where, again, the fact that she ends up going immediately after she comes back isn't particularly shocking there, though I think it is a spot still where I don't think is active enough and was, again, on the bottom for long enough that I put her here in 142. Now 141, a player that I think you could argue is worse than Georgia, though I think it's a player that has more potential and probably did more actively in the game. That player is Amy from Blood vs. Water. And Amy's a player, again, was not particularly well positioned for a lot of the game. Yeah, she was in the majority during that first vote, but even then it was a spot where she didn't want David to go. And at the second vote, she gets her way in getting Sophie out, but then he gets immediately flipped on immediately after that. And again, is a big target, potentially would have gone home had she not found an idol, which again, those are things to criticize for sure. Now she eventually gets the swap, and obviously again, Sandra's taken out before her, but then she's taken out unceremoniously afterwards, where again, it's a bit of a weird game. I do think there was enough active play from Amy, particularly in the Sophie vote, that I think it demonstrates a lot of potential there, though it's also a spot where she spends, again, a lot of the game on the bottom, and through that, again, I think she's kind of similar to Georgia. Though I do think the more active play we saw from Amy is good enough to land her spot higher here. So again, I'm putting her here at number 141. Now, number 140, we're moving on to a player that I'm kind of surprised is this high, because I didn't really expect him to be this high, but again, he's someone that I think demonstrates some skills for a game. That player is Kent from AU 2017, and Kent's a player here that, again, initially was going to be lower, as again, he's someone that I think is probably an early boot on most given seasons. Even in the season that we did see, he was almost the first boot. Again, it literally got to a tie vote, and I do think Ken kind of struggled with building bonds with certain people, though in the grand scheme of things, I think Kent actually plays this fairly well, especially coming from a position where he was this potential target in the first round. I think he actually ends up making some pretty integral relationships and does so fairly well, again, bonding with the likes of Henry and Jackie, and he ends up really being screwed over by the idiocy of Henry and him swapping over to the other tribe, giving the opposing alliance the numbers to where even then he's not the primary target. Again, Jackie's taken out over him, but then eventually obviously he's on a next opportunity. But again, I think he put in a valiant fight. I do think Kent demonstrates some skills here in being able to play from the bottom for a bit, though ultimately, again, it's not a particularly great game, but for someone of his archetype, I think he played well enough to be here number 140. Now 139, moving into more actively bad players, but players that definitely had some major upsides. And at 139, we're moving on to Sarah from Titans vs. Rebels. And Sarah's a player here that, again, was a little frustrating, as I do think there's a lot of natural skill in the game for Sarah. She's someone that is very likable, someone very athletic, to where it never really felt like she was in danger until her eventual boot round. And again, I think that's fairly impressive considering she was on the bottom for most of the season, where, again, I think obviously the fact that she was tied in with the, Tobias, Alex, and Peeta of it all, that's not great. Again, she was on the bottom from the very beginning, but despite that, again, she was the person that was talked about as being the target the least, where, again, her name never really was brought up as a potential target. If anything, actually, they actually almost made her just swing vote during the Tobias vote. That was what was meant to happen, is that she was going to decide between Tobias and Alex, which is kind of insane considering her positioning, to where, following that, again, she ends up right in the middle pretty well, where she wasn't really in any danger for his next few rounds, or Rihanna would have gone, where I think there's at least some decent play there. Now, obviously, when we get to the swap, it's not great. I mean, she ends up really trusting Caroline and Kitty too much. She ends up not trusting Mark in a spot where he was trying to save her. And again, all that is fairly bad, but I do think there is some pretty decent play, particularly in the middle of her game, again, after the Peeta vote off, to where, again, she's able to maintain a fairly strong position considering her alliance being on the bottom. So because of that, for me, it's good enough to put her at 139. Now 138, a player that also is frustrating and actually probably has higher highs but lower lows than Sarah, and that player is Max from Brains vs. Brawn 2. And Max, again, is a very frustrating player because, again, there is so much potential there. I feel like he's someone that at least gets the basic tenets of the game. He's someone that I think played fairly well post-swap, despite the fact that he ends up being taken out immediately after the swap, to where I think he gets really screwed over by Miles finding an idol and him just being this backup target, though. again, I don't think he had necessarily the wrong idea in that spot where, again, him flipping over to the Brawn and trying to secure his spot to merge is not the wrong call there. And I think him putting in a lot of legwork to build a bond with the likes of Jesse and Ben, again, I do think that was the right call in his position, though it just ends up not really working out for him. Now, despite that, his early game is very rocky. Obviously, it's a spot where he is technically in the majority for his first few rounds, though even then, there's this like big Coven contingent that definitely has a lot of influence there. But again, he has good connections with the likes of Logan and Laura, where he is fairly safe for all of it. And really, that's the thing, is that even though he was someone that was a very messy player and was not necessarily the best position long term, I do think he had some pretty decent short term positioning, where he always had someone like Rich that was going to be targeted over him. And even then, they had some level of insulation through their relationship with Laura and Logan. Now, obviously, the alley boot round in particular is like pretty asinine. Like, it is pretty horrible play. The fact that he has this really overpowered advantage and still fails to do anything with it. And really, in reality, the plan really blows up on him, and it could have been a spot where, had they voted for him, he would have gone. Again, all that is so bad that it kind of makes him a bit weird to rank here. Yeah, again, I do think there are some upsides here. I do think, in comparison to Sarah, I think he at least was fairly well positioned early on. He at least was in that initial majority on the tribe. I think he had the right idea towards the end of his game. It just didn't really work out for him. So I think for me, that's enough to put him here at 138. And 137, moving on to a player that kind of similar-ish thing to a degree. We're moving on to Ben from Blood vs. Water. And Ben also is a tough player because he was one that was really just in and out of the majority constantly, where initially he was in the majority alongside Sophie and had Sophie as this like pretty big shield for him. Though Sophie eventually gets taken out, and then he's kind of on the bottom, but even then he has like pretty strong bonds with people on the opposing side, to where it leads to this flip against Amy, which I think is pretty decent from him and his alliance in that spot. Though we get to the swap where he's really just kind of on the bottom at that point, where again Sophie goes again, and then eventually he's voted out but gets saved by Anonalim, only for him to then save himself during the Croc boot round. But again, that was a spot where I do think him targeting Croc to begin with was not his optimal play, and then he proceeds to just be taken out again immediately following that, to where, again, it's a very rocky game, lots of ups and downs. So I think there was, again, a sliver of pretty solid play where he did seem to be in an initial good position. He also did have a couple points where he was able to recover and get the votes on his side, like Jay and Croc went out, to where, while I disagree if his decision-making at points, I do think, again, there's enough decent play in all that to where, while sloppy, it's good enough to put him here at 137. Now 136, another very sloppy player. We're moving on to Rowan from A2016, and Rowan is, again, just kind of a big flame out here. He's someone that, again, was fairly well positioned early on, has initial alliance with the likes of Lee and Elle and Phoebe, and they were really running the show on the original tribe. And while, again, there was definitely some sketchiness with his idol and how he was handling that, it did seem like, again, there was not really a potential flip in the works there. It really did feel like he was in a pretty powerful position on that tribe. That is, until they swap, and at that point, he plays pretty horribly, where, again, he decides to target Kat in a spot where, again, Kat is one of your only numbers. Why are you doing that? Also, at least the Kat flipping on him, that's also not good. And in general, again, his overall management of his relationships with the likes of Kat and Christy was obviously very bad. But also, even then beyond that, he proceeds to idle himself out of the game, which is obviously not good either. Which in itself is bad, but like not astronomically bad. I think what makes it even worse is, again, the fact that he votes for Kat to not even give himself a tie. But then also, again, it is due to his poor relationships with Kat and Christy that caused this to begin with. Where, again, all this I think is fairly bad. Though, again, I think the fact that he was in such a dominant position during the early portions of the game, again, something that even the last few people we haven't really had, where, again, they were kind of in and out of the majority at points. Rowan was someone that was really in the majority until he was swap screwed. And while, again, he didn't play this swap well at all, I do feel like, again, the fact that he was well positioned, at least on the offset, is, again, good enough to put him here at number 136. Now, number 135, keeping with players that had control at a point, we're moving on to Andrew from AU 2016. And Andrew, to be fair, I think you could debate a little bit more if he really had any true control, where it really felt like the likes of Jenna Louise and Craig were really the ones in the power position. He was just kind of there in the middle alongside them. But again, Andrew's someone that definitely had some influence early on in the game. He is part of the vote to take out Nick, and then proceeds to maintain his spot in the majority following that. And even after the swap, he is trying to play both sides, and to for poorly. I do think he blows up his spot, where it really is at that point in the game where Kate ends up not trusting him and wants to take him out. And again, and it eventually leads to the flip against him, which is obviously not good. But again, he's someone that is a big fan of the show, clearly knows the game, was definitely very influential during the early portions of the game, though again, just kind of had the game blow up on him by the end. part of that due to his own bad play, but yeah, I don't think his play is as astronomically bad as Rowan's, to where really I think they're like fairly similar. Rowan actually probably has a better like early game with how well positioned he was early on, though I do think Andrew's downfall isn't as astronomically bad as Rowan. So again, I'm going to put him here at number 135. And number 134, same thing. We're moving on to Joey from Brains with Brawn. And again, Joey, essentially same thing. Again, someone that was in a power position early on, had a lot of influence early on in his tribe, was running the dominant alliance, though again was doing so too openly to the fact that the others end up gathering together and voting him out right before the swap. Again, it's a very similar game. Technically, Joey's booted earlier than both the likes of Rowan and Andrew. Yeah, I feel like with Joey also, again, like I just don't feel like he does that much like actively wrong by the end, where really a lot of the issues really just him coming out a bit too out in front, though I don't think he did that much like actively wrong to like push people away or messed up who exactly he was like going for. I don't think his mistakes here were as bad as the last two people we talked about, along with the fact that again, he was this actual like dominant figure within his alliance, the one kind of running the show within his group. So again, I think that's something to give him a little bit of credit for too. So again, I have him at 134. Now 133. We're moving on to 3 players in a row, all from the same season, all from similar spots in the game, but we're going to be starting it off with Tegan from Champions Centers 1. And Tegan's a little bit tough, as obviously she was someone that was booted initially, came back, and after she came back, didn't play horribly. Yeah, I do think she is someone that, for me, is at the bottom of this grouping here, simply because, again, she was voted out first of the 3. She was someone that was on the bottom. She was someone that initially had a power position, though, again, gets flipped on, and then at that point gets taken out, and again, has to be saved by a twist. Though when she comes back, and she's able to get back with the majority, but even then is failing to get rid of Benji, someone that she very openly knows is against her, and again, that's pretty bad. But again, it does lead to her surviving a couple votes there, and then we eventually get to the swap where she's given a pretty bad hand, and even then, she does survive over Jackie. So where, again, I think there's a lot of skills for the game here. Yeah, again, in comparison to the next 2 people we'll be talking about, they both made it naturally further than her, where had it not been for her non-limp, she would have been booted early, and even then, I don't necessarily agree with some of the strategic decisions she made. So for me, I still have her at this point in the list at 133. Now 132, moving on to the player. Again, I think you could debate for sure that this player is worse than Tegan, because I think there are probably less upsides to this player, but I think they were a bit more screwed in how they left the game. That player is Anita from Champions Centers 1. And Anita's a player that I didn't think gets largely screwed over just due to perception, where again, she was really in a spot where she actually did have some pretty good social bonds, was in a pretty good spot on the tribe, though kind of gets sniped out by Heath because she's looked at as a physical liability, and that's kind of it. But again, even then, it's a spot where she's really the sole vote, where obviously Heath ends up having to use his idol successfully to take her out. And again, I think that's something to give a lot of credit to Anita here, to where I think there are arguments that, again, she should be lower, because, again, does she make it deep on most given seasons? Probably not. And again, is she very likely to win the season? Also probably not. But I think she is a player that, again, found her grouping, was able to avoid being targeted for a lot of the season to the point that she actually finally gets taken out. It's a spot where she's taken out by 1 vote. And again, to me, I think that demonstrates, again, some decent capabilities as a player, especially for someone in her archetype, to where, again, for me, that's enough to put her at 132. Now number 131, and we're moving on to, again, a player from this same grouping. We're moving on to Heath. And I also, again, think there's an argument Heath should be lower in the fact that, again, for a guy that's this big, a guy that should be such a powerhouse in challenges, he was someone that was not particularly well positioned towards the back end of his run, where he was someone that obviously would have gotten voted out had he not used an idol during the Anita vote, and following that, isn't really able to make any inroads post a swap. Though, with that said, again, like Tegan, he is fairly well positioned early on. He does end up seemingly playing the middle from the offset, though obviously, again, gets flipped on eventually. But again, once Tegan ends up returning to the game, we do see him, again, just kind of riding with the majority there, not being targeted once again. And I think that's something to at least credit him for, especially for, again, a guy that would have been voted out unanimously had it not been for an idol just before this. So where I think there is some impressive play there from Heath, but really outside that, again, I think Heath is just a player that has a lot of potential but doesn't really demonstrate much of that. Again, he really feels like a player that should have no reason to be voted out early on really any season. Yeah, again, here he was almost taken out pre-swap, and I feel like that's something that feels pretty bad from him, especially when he's eventually taken out before the merge as well, where, again, there's a lot of upsides, there's a lot of downsides, where while I do think there probably is some potential for Heath if he ever were to return, I think there's enough, obviously, downsides here to where can't put him too much higher here than number 131. Now number 130, we're moving on to a player that I actually thought would be much lower on this list. Yet when really thinking about it, I actually don't feel like this player did that much like actively wrong. And that player is Ben from AU 2017. And Ben's a player that I thought at least would be under like the last grouping of players. These players that had a level of control, as Ben, someone that never really had any control in the game. However, Ben's also somebody that was also fairly safe for a lot of the game. And I feel like that's something I'll at least give him credit for here, is the fact that he, again, was, while someone that was like fairly expendable in the game, he was someone that was never really brought up as a target, someone that also had some connections in the game where, again, it seemed like he was with the likes of like Luke and Jericho early on, stays in the majority when voting out Mark and Sam. He ends up being swapped over. And it's about where I at least respect the fact that he recognized that he was not particularly high on the pecking order and wanted to swap over tribes to try out something new. And again, obviously it wasn't necessarily the optimal play, as again, it's not other possibility that he would have gone had he gone a tribal, but I don't think he plays that portion of the game that wrong. And really, obviously, he ends up being voted out after the second swap, though even that is a position where it wasn't the initial target, and there definitely were people that did want him to stay, though obviously puts his foot in his mouth a bit, and also Michelle just plays that particularly well and being able to sell to the others why they should want him out. So I think it's a spot here where, yeah, Ben gets outplayed by the end, though I think in comparison to a lot of the players we've been talking about so far, I do think the fact that he was fairly safe throughout a lot of the game, and even by the time he goes, not a spot where he was dead to rights, I think it's good enough to put him here at 130. Now 129, moving on to a player that I also thought would be below this last grouping of players, though I at least have respect for how much this player was able to survive in the game, and that player is Paige from Champs vs. Contenders. And Paige is a player that I think there is some pretty bad play from her. The fact that she was trying to work with the men while the men were actually trying to vote her out. Again, that's not particularly good. Though I think there's something about Paige that I do respect the hustle. I mean, she's someone that was trying to actively play both sides, and while eventually it caught up to her and she was eventually taken out pretty late into the pre-merge phase, I do think there was at least some decent play from her, and her getting into these groups to the point where the women did save her in the game, despite her, again, kind of ratting them out. Also, she ends up finding her way into that, like, Shawnee, Fenella, Anita grouping when they're voting out, like, the likes of Tegan and attempting to vote out Heath. And even after they come back into the game, we have Zach being taken out over her. So again, she makes it fairly deep in the season and survives a decent amount of tribals for someone that was booted before the swap, to where I think there is some decent play in there. Again, there's also some really bad play, to where I do think she's a largely inconsistent player, though I do respect the hustle at least. So again, I do have her here at number 129. Now at 128, we're moving on to a player that almost made the merge, though also doesn't do anything particularly great throughout her run, but again, at least survived a lot of tribals. That player is Odette from AU 2017, and kind of in a similar mold. Odette is someone that was never really in a power position for a lot of the game. She was actually really kind of on the bottom for a decent chunk of the game, where again, she was on the bottom during the Joan vote, and then after that she kind of just like rode with the majority and actually did build some bonds with the likes of like Mark and Jackie, though even then they get flipped on and she's on the bottom once again, and she ends up being in a okay position while like Sarah's kind of blowing up her game, but even immediately after that she gets taken out as someone that's expendable, to where, you know, Odette is someone that was just like largely just there for a lot of the season. Again, makes it pretty deep. Again, survives a lot of tribals, which is something to definitely give her credit for, is a major reason why she's as high on the list as she is. But really outside that, she's someone that never really found herself in that strong of a position. She was always just kind of on the bottom, whatever group she was in, and never was able to gain any true traction in the game. So ultimately, again, I do think it's a spot here where Odette isn't a particularly good player, yet we're still at the spot where, again, a lot of these players are still really bad. So, again, I have Odette here at 128. Now, 127, speaking of bad players, we have a two-time player. And one that I think you could argue is probably worse than this, but at 127, I do have Zach from Champs vs. Contenders and also All-Stars. And, again, it did seem like he initially had some influence on his tribe, where during the Matt Dyson vote, it did seem like he was part of this initial majority, but then eventually he gets flipped on because he's a dick, and the women end up flipping on him and taking out Steve, who was someone he was building a bond with. And then following that, we have him kind of being kept around due to physical strength, and also the fact that he's like this big shield for someone like a Benji in particular, to where, again, he kind of gets kept around, but not really much due to his actively good play from him, and really he's just like pissing off people, making comments that people are upset by, and again, that's not good. However, again, he survives in decent ways. He survives over Tegan initially. He survives over Anita. He was meant to survive over Heath, where Heath was meant to go out if he didn't have his idol. Where, again, I think Zach survives in decent ways into that season, only eventually be kind of taken out as this like scapegoat for the Tegan situation. But then even when he returns, he's someone that eventually ends up playing fine, in the sense that he finds himself into a majority, works alongside David. Eventually he's taken out due to, again, him not treating Jackie well, but also, again, it was a very wonky vote. He takes he gets taken down to plurality. Again, there's some wonkiness there, though even in that spot, he was like kind of voted out early on the season, where, I mean, technically he was the backup and ended up being like a non-elim that the top two people went out on. But still, again, he was not in a particularly good position early on in the game either, where despite him being this like bro-y guy, he wasn't really able to get in with this like sporty group. And I feel like that is also indicative of some pretty poor play as well. Again, Zach's not a particularly good player, but he does have at least a run that does take him fairly deep into the season and does survive a good chunk of trials really on both of his seasons. So I guess it's good enough to put him here at number 127. Number 126. And now we're moving on to essentially the more swap screwed players in the show's history. Players that definitely had some potential in the game, though a swap ended up putting them in a much worse position than they started off on. So let's start that all off. We're starting it off with Casey from Champions Contenders 2. And Casey's a player that I do think played very sloppily after the swap, though I think coming into the swap, she seemed to be in a fairly decent position. It felt like no one was really targeting Casey. It felt like she had some decent allies with the likes of Harry and Andy, where, again, it felt like she had some decent short-term safety, though obviously gets swapped into a fairly poor position where she's on the bottom. Though, again, in that position, I do think she plays pretty poorly. Obviously, she like rats everything out about Harry to the others in a spot where it definitely would have been for her a lot more to try to make a move alongside Harry and utilize his idol to the best that she could, but instead she ends up being taken out by his idol, which again, at the end of the day, she's still taken out by an idol, and I think that's definitely something to give her a sliver of praise for, that she wasn't the primary target. Though I do think her lava play in the post swap was very frustrating, though again, it was perpetuated by her being on the bottom because of a swap, to where, again, considering I do feel like she was in a somewhat okay position early on, even then those dynamics weren't really like fully fleshed out, but again, it's still, I guess, good enough to put her in this grouping at 126. Now 125, moving on to a player that's essentially just one step above Casey, and that player is Matt from AU 2019, aka Grayson Waller, I think is his name, from wrestling, but either way, where before the swap he seemed to be in a fairly okay position on his original tribe. Now, again, not great in the sense that he was kind of picking fights with people and like openly talking about who he's going to target, and even then like trash talking the other tribe. And again, there definitely was some sloppy play and all that, but I do think for the most part, again, was safe in the game, was not going to be in danger until the swap. And even after swapping, and he was safer than the likes of Harry and Casey, where he's really the last name to be mentioned. Mind you, again, some of that's due to challenge strength, but again, ultimately he gets taken out in a spot where he's really idled out of the game, where it is Harry's idol that ends up taking out of the game, where if it really wasn't for that, Matt was not meant to be the target at that point. And even then, I feel like Matt is someone that, had he been able to get back in with the other contenders, maybe would have been able to crawl them together, with him being a big presence in terms of wanting a contender to win the game. And I think he would have fought to make that merge vote not Andy, so that's at least something. But ultimately, again, Matt still is not a great player, though I think gets taken out due to some fairly unlucky circumstances in a spot where I do think he had some potential had he survived beyond that. So again, I do have him here at number 125. At number 124, moving on to another swaps group player, though now we're starting a little grouping here of players that did have actual influence in the game. They were in positions that they were running the tribe before they were swapped, which ends up being a very unlucky circumstance for them. So again, we're starting all that off here with Rachel from Brains vs. Brawn. And Rachel's a player, again, another one, I don't know if she's necessarily the greatest player in the world. She definitely does seem to be fairly emotional in how she maneuvers through the game, where if it wasn't for Haley, I don't know if she really would have been willing to be voting with George to take out Joey, which definitely would have been her best move at that spot, to where I think she's someone that I definitely do question her abilities as a player, especially considering, again, how hostile she was towards George. And again, that stuff's not good. However, Rachel's someone that was in a pretty powerful position before the swap. I mean, she was someone that alongside Haley was really in the center of everything. And had they not swapped, she would have been really running that entire tribe, though we got a swap. And at that point, she ends up being on the bottom. Now, not technically numbers wise, where obviously, again, George and Kara end up flipping. And again, that's obviously a failing on them. But still, it's a spot where Rachel does go from a very good position to a pretty bad position. And even in that position, again, she survives a little bit at least. Mind you, an idol gets played on her along the way. And obviously, you had like Georgia being sick. That definitely helped her get deeper. But again, it is a spot where I do think Rachel has some upsides here. Again, Rachel definitely gets severely disadvantaged by how the swap plays out. The fact that she loses her number one ally, the fact that she ends up being with her biggest enemy in George, and also the fact that she went from a good position to a bad position, to where I, again, do think there's enough upside here for Rachel. I do think there's enough aspects of her being screwed over to where I'm willing to put her this high here at number 124. Number 123, kind of similar thing. Another player that maybe played a little bit sloppy, but also did get screwed over by the swap, and that player is Viola from Titans vs. Rebels. And again, Viola is also in this spot here where after the swap, I think she played pretty sloppy. Again, the fact that she's very openly willing to take out Caroline, then never actually made the move, obviously opened up the opportunity for Caroline taking the shot at her. Again, that's pretty bad. However, before the swap, she would have had the numbers to do that. And she did seem to have the stars aligned to be able to make that move until obviously the swap happened. And through that, she ends up being on the bottom to where obviously, again, there's still fault here from Viola and her not like recognizing that the votes are not on her side, where again, she definitely should have been able to really organize the votes that Caroline was able to organize and flip the vote onto Caroline, though again, she just didn't. And I think that is definitely a failing on her. Yeah, again, it's still a position where, again, like Rachel, she was in a very strong position before the swap where her, Valeria, and Mark were really in the center of things and would have really controlled where the next vote went. And I think that's something to at least, again, give her credit for here, to where, well, ultimately, again, there is definitely some lackluster play here. And how loose she was with the fact that she was openly going after Caroline, I do feel like for that to ultimately end up mattering, take a pretty unlucky swap. So again, I am going to still put her here at number 123. Now 122, moving on to a player that seemed to be loved on the island, though really don't know why. We do have Paige from AU Heroes Villains, and Paige is someone that, again, seemed to be in a fairly good position on her original tribe, where it seemed like really that Heroes tribe just adored her, and she was in a safe position, a position where, again, she seemed to be a very valuable number to that majority. Again, a majority that contained mostly returning players, yet she was involved in that, and again, I think that's something at least to credit her for. Now, beyond that, she's a bit of a sloppy player. Obviously, again, her wine does like swap over to the other tribe. That was really bad. After the swap, she obviously doesn't do a particularly good job at managing her relationships with the likes of Shawnee and George. Ends up being an easy target for them. Even though I do think she was disfavored by the swap and the fact that she lost all of her allies, it was a spot where she was like fundamentally screwed by the swap. And I think she was just someone that was really unable to build connections with people from the other side. And yeah, something to give her credit for, though, is the fact that she was taken out by an idol play, where if it wasn't for that, it would have been at least a tied vote. And again, who knows what would happen there, to where, again, at least credit her for that. But ultimately, again, just a player that I don't think is a particularly good player in the grand scheme of things, but someone that seemed to really have some traction on that season in particular. Yeah, I think it's good enough to be here at 122. Now 121. And another player here that ended up being fairly swap screwed in the game. Definitely a player that had a lot of potential coming into the swap phase, though quickly has that not worked to their favor. And that player is Shannon from Brains versus Brawn. And Shannon's a player that, again, seemed to be running her original tribe. While she did seem to have some friction with Simon from the offset, she did seem to have a really strong core alliance that really stuck together for his first few rounds, and definitely had a potential to be really running a lot of the show deep into the game. Now, even within that, there is some questionable play during the Benny vote round where she ends up switching her vote there, which, again, obviously you don't want to cause a tie, though I do think it showed some inability to really keep Big D in line in that spot. And she does get to the swap where, again, she does get swap screwed to a degree, at least swapped screwed out of a good position, where technically she is swapped with a majority of her original tribe, though she swapped with the people that she wasn't working with, people like Simon, people like Danny, people like Chelsea, and ends up losing some of her integral numbers like Flick and Gerald. And now technically she does end up losing the battle for the swing votes, where again she had the same potential as the other grouping to pick up Haley and the other brains as numbers, which she fails to do. Though at the end of the day, Shannon's really this high, mainly because of me thinking she has potential. I think in comparison to Paige is just somebody that I don't know if she's necessarily able to do what she was able to do in most given groups. I think it takes a specific group of people for her to gain traction in the game. I feel like Shannon is someone that is more likely to be able to do what she was able to do on her original tribe more times than not. And it's really that potential that for me lands her higher here, even though she does have more flaws in her game than the last few we talked about. But again, I felt like she is good enough to be here at number 121. Number 120, another player that was kind of in a good position at a point, but then I guess taken out on two for this is really on him, but I do think there's at least some decent play in the middle of all this. And that player is Croc from Blood versus Water. And Croc's a player here that, and it seemed like there was a point in the game where he had a lot of influence in the game, where it did seem like he initially had that majority in the post-swap tribe. And even before that, again, was playing decently early on. Again, kind of similar to Ben from his season as well early on, where, again, he was kind of with Sophie, had Sophie as a shield. Once Sophie left, he was able to recover pretty well, had decent relationships with like Sandra. He was able to flip the vote into his favor. And again, I think that's something to definitely give him credit for. And then after the swap, again, we see him really be in this like more power position alongside like the likes of Sam and Jesse and Chrissy, where again, it did feel like he was in a spot where he could have been running the show, especially with an idol in his pocket, though obviously again, the vote eventually flips on him with Ben kind of leading the vote against him, which to be fair, was kind of a misunderstanding where again, Croc was at least trying to save Ben at a point, and Ben kind of misguidingly takes out Croc thinking he's against him, which again is an issue still. Yeah, I do think it's a spot here where Croc at least seemed to have a level of influence early on, and I think definitely would have had potential had he survived over that round, or had he gotten to the merge. I do think there would have been a pretty soft landing spot for him, especially through his connection with Chrissy and then his connection with like Jordan, where I think there definitely would have been some inroads for him had he survived that round. But ultimately, there was enough bad play there where, again, it became a bit tough to really rank him. But ultimately, I felt like he kind of deserves to be alongside these players that got taken out around the swap phase of the game. So again, he's here at number 120. Now number 119. Now moving on to players that made the merge, though probably shouldn't have made the merge, though still had like a level of influence at a point, and starting that off with Jesse from Brains vs. Brawn 2. And Jesse's someone that I think, had we seen more of him, probably would have been a more genuinely bad player. I think he's someone that, from what we saw, did not seem to be making the correct calls for his game. It seemed to be somebody that kind of played the middle a bit too hard, and he seemed to be somebody that, like, while he did have some decent positioning early on, he makes some seemingly questionable calls and is kind of very elusive information, a spot that's kind of damning to him, to where I think the way that Jesse actively plays the game is pretty bad, yet despite that he was in a pretty decent position early on, again, was in the majority alliance, was seemingly a major decision maker within that, seemingly being in the middle of most groupings in the game, having this connection to like the Nash side of things, while also having his own alliance with like some Noonan and Paulie, to where, again, I think there's definitely some impressive play there from Jesse in terms of his positioning, though obviously we get to the swap where he lets Max go, which I think was a misguided move for him, and then proceeds to actually have the votes flip against him, where had it not been for Anonim, Jesse likely goes home even before the merge, and that's something to definitely criticize him for. And a lot of that really stems from him really mismanaging his allies, where likes of Morgan and Kate end up flipping against him there. And then by the time we get to the merge, he's just this easy consensus boot where no one's really fighting for him to stay, where Paulie's the only person to even end up voting with him. It's not a particularly good game. It's one that, again, he definitely had a lot of influence early on, though kind of loses that by the end of the post-swap phase of the game. And it's kind of an easy merge boot to where, again, I debate on where exactly to land him. I still think he's above that last few players we talked about, just because, again, he was in this fairly dominant position early on and was able to at least maintain that positioning a little bit after the swap, though realistically, it's, again, he should be alongside these players that were taken out around the swap, because, again, he should have been taken out around the swap. So, again, I do end up landing him here at number 119. Now, number 118, someone from Jesse's season, I think is just a tad better, if even that, if you debate it, where I ultimately end up putting Paulie here from Brains vs. Brawn 2. And Paulie, again, for me, was a big debate here, because, like, Paulie's someone that I think on paper could be worse. Like, obviously, Paulie was just more dead in the water after the swap, never was able to gain any traction. Even after the merge, had more time to try to put things together, and even then failed. To where, again, Paulie's game is really one where he's on the bottom for really the entire post-swap phase on, and is never able to really recover from that. However, I think the thing that gives me a pro for Paulie is that I think Paulie, while failing, was at least trying to play a bit more optimally. Again, he was trying to keep the original Brawn together at a point, though, again, things kind of fractured around him. Even by the time he ends up being this like weird split vote situation where, again, that was a spot where he wasn't necessarily going home if there hadn't been that twist involved. And also, again, like Jesse, again, he was in a very good position early on, seemed to be one of the people running the tribe. To where, well, again, there definitely is a very bad stretch for him in the game. I don't feel like he's an entirely bad player, especially one that I think he could definitely improve if he were to return. Like, in comparison to Jesse in particular, I think Jesse plays the game more actively wrong, where I feel like Paulie was, again, more disfavored in terms of the positions he was given. So, again, I do have Paulie a step above him here at number 118. Now, 117, kind of a similar thing. Another player that was kind of dead man walking for a lot of the season, despite the fact that it didn't seem like this person did that much actively wrong, and that was kind of just like based on perception. That player is Khan from Blood vs. Water. And to be fair, I think there's a serious argument that Khan should be lower than the likes of Jesse and Paulie, where Khan is someone that, like, even within his initial tribe, while it seemed like he had like some influence in the game and was definitely playing the game fairly hard, he's someone that like never really seemed to have people like actively wanting to work with him, particularly deep into the season. It really felt like a spot where he was always looked at as this like threatening player from early on. And obviously, again, there's definitely some biases in play with that, but again, it did feel like Khan was someone that was never really trusted, and it was never really going to be given that much legroom in the game. Yeah, despite that, made it fairly far. Now, obviously, and this does have some situations where he would have probably gone. He gets very lucky along the way. Though in the post swap phase of the game, I actually think he plays fairly well there. Again, he's able to get in with Chrissy, and they're able to become kind of a duo that able to attach themselves to like Sam and Jesse. And again, I think there is some decent play there from Khan. Even by the time he ends up going, it was something that Sam didn't want to happen. And again, had this not been a Blood versus Water season, I think there's at least a shot that Sam pushes for that vote to not go through. Yeah. So again, while Khan was largely ineffective in the game for a lot of it, I do feel like there's at least some upsides there for Khan, where I think there's at least more time where he wasn't like scraping on the bottom like someone like Paulie. So again, I do have him here at number 117. Number 116, we're moving on to a player that is a two-time player, but was he though? At number 116, I do have Andy from Heroes Contenders 2 and also Blood vs. Water. And Andy, from Blood vs. Water, I don't really take much out of his appearance there, as it really felt like a spot where he was kind of screwed from the offset. Didn't want to work with him from the very beginning due to his reputation on this previous season, and again, he was just kind of screwed on that season. However, the thing I am going to take into account here is his first appearance, which is, again, kind of middling. It's really one where, yes, there were some decent instincts at points. He seemed to be someone that had some influence early on. After the swap, I feel like while he ends up being blindsided there eventually, I do think he actually does play the middle decently well initially. Just the problem is that he is Andy, and he's someone that like people don't really trust on the offset, and that's obviously always going to cause him issues. But I think he's someone that, again, kind of had the right idea of like trying to get in with David and Luke and get them to play their idols, kind of like flush their idols, but also take out a person from his own side that he wasn't particularly close to. Where I think there was some like decent play in all that. It's just that, again, it was very see-through and ends up actually like further pissing off David and Luke even more, with them fully knowing that he's doing that to flush their idols. And again, it's a spot where there definitely is some sloppiness and all that. And obviously it creates trust between him and his original alliance, where by the time we get to the merge, he's obviously just kind of a dead man walking. He's kind of just the easy merge dude, despite the fact that he really shouldn't be, where again, his original contenders have no real reason to be wanting him out of the game, yet they end up taking him out because he's so untrustworthy, which really just further sinks their games where they're on the bottom following that, to where ultimately, again, I think obviously it's a flaw against them for taking that route, but it's also a flaw against Andy to not shore up the votes to stay in that position. Right, I think he just plays a very messy game, one where I can kind of see where he's coming from, and I do think there are like aspects of his game that are admirable. There's also just a lot of sloppiness along the way as well, to where it like finally ends up catching up to him the following season, where he ends up being screwed on the offset because of all that. Yeah, ultimately, again, I do think he's a player that has some skills, but still extremely flawed, but enough to put him here at 116. Now, number 115, we're moving on to a player that demonstrated a lot of potential while he was there and does get taken out due to, again, a weird circumstance, though definitely also had some lows to his game as well, and that player is Garrick from Titans vs. Rebels. And Garrick's a player here that obviously had a very core alliance. He was very close to Ferris and Raymond and Eileen, and again, he definitely had a decent backing around him, and through that, again, remained fairly safe early on, though is eventually taken out at the swap, kind of as a safe foe because they know that Ferris has an idol, which again is a little wonkiness there, and especially in a spot where it's again a post-swap tribal, and a spot where they did seem to have the numbers before the swap, or again, definitely a lot of upside there for Garrick, especially considering he had a fairly correct read on the situation, something that Ferris didn't even have, to where I think there's definitely some things to really prop up Garrick here for, though at the same time, I do think Garrick is someone that probably let his emotions get ahead of him a bit too much. I think he made it too openly known to Kirby that he was against her, which leads to Kirby flipping the vote onto him. And while again, it probably wouldn't have mattered had they not gone to the swap, where again, he was pretty well insulated within his original group, to where again, there definitely was a lot of unluckiness in play with how all that played out, though at the same time, I just feel like Garrick is someone that, yes, I do think he had a decent read on the game, yes, I do think he had a solid alliance, but I do think it is the fact that he did seem to be a fairly emotionally driven player. It does make him a bit tougher to rank here in the grand scheme of things. Again, I ended up landing him here at number 115. Number 114, moving on to another kind of swap screwed player, one that was taken out due to an idol here, that definitely had some potential in the long term, and that player is Noonan from Brains vs. Brawn 2. And Noonan's a player that, again, seemed to be fairly well positioned early on, where I remember coming into the season, I was very questioning of would she fit into that original Brawn tribe, though it did feel like she was able to build some instant bonds with the likes of Paulie and Candy and Jesse and Ben, where again, they seem to be really running a show in that original tribe, and it did seem like she had an influence there. But then we get to the swap where she's obviously swapped onto the bottom, but even then, I actually feel like she plays okay initially. Again, building a bond with AJ and opening up a lot more inroads for later in the game had she gotten there, though I think a major issue comes from the fact that we do get to the Ursula vote where she really ends up blowing up her spot and really sinking the Braun's chances of getting the numbers in that position. Along with that, proceeds to also make it very well known to AJ how much she hates him at that point, and again just increase the target on her back, though ultimately again it didn't seem like it was going to matter, where it seemed like Paulie was the bigger target ahead of her either way. And I do think that's an interesting spot for Noonan, where again, had she survived that round, where again had Paulie not played his idol, I think Noonan would have actually been in an okay spot for down the road. Like, it definitely would have been a position where she would have had more inroads than the likes of Paulie, who again just everyone seemed to not trust from the offset, where again people did seem to like Noonan and did want to work with her, to where again I do think she definitely had some potential there that she was kind of screwed out of, though at the same time I do think there was some fairly suboptimal play along the way. I do think the way that she ends up handling her relationship with AJ in particular was pretty misguided, along for also not really campaigning much for herself towards the end and kind of moping around when she got injured was also not particularly great either. But yeah, I do think there is a lot of potential there for Noonan, especially with how unlucky she was in her eventual elimination. So again, I do have her here at 114. Now 113. Moving on to a player that's actually kind of questionable that are in this group, as they're not actually a swap screwed player, unlike everyone else, but they were a screwed player, and that player is Frazier from Here's the Villains. Obviously the victim of episode 7, and someone that, again, was just kind of fine in the game. I mean, realistically, it's not like Frazier's a particularly good player. At least he's not a particularly active player. He just kind of went alongside Jordy and did whatever Jordy did. But again, I think with that, was fairly safe for a lot of the season. Didn't do anything like actively wrong to cause his elimination. He was kind of just taken out as this like casualty of war, this kind of backup, kind of this like safe foe, this person that would be easy to take out while keeping in the bigger players in the game. And Frazier's just someone that, again, I don't think does that much wrong to cause his elimination, especially a spot where he was not meant to be the initial boot. Again, it was a spot where it was supposed to be Simon. Obviously, Simon ends up winning immunity, and even after that, it takes a plurality vote to end up eliminating him from the game. To where, I mean, all things considered, I do think Frazier ends up not having an entirely bad game here. Yeah, it's still a position here where obviously he didn't lock in the relationships with the Spice Girls well enough to make them not vote for him in that spot. And also, I don't really know what his long-term prospects are, considering he didn't really seem to be the most active player in the world. But again, in the grand scheme of things, he is fairly screwed over. Again, he definitely was not meant to go out in the spot that he did. So again, I feel like it's good enough to put him here at 113. Now, number 112, we're moving on to a player that was swap screwed to a degree, also has some very wonky circumstances leading to their eventual elimination, and that player is Danny, aka Big D from Brains vs. Brawn. And Danny's a weird player to really assess here, because he's really one that obviously gets taken out in a fluke, in the sense that he is seemingly voted out in a spot where he has like Kara switching her vote, which leads to him being taken out in a plurality, and a spot where the minority ends up voting for him, or even then there's like an idol in play. And again, just a very weird circumstance leading to his elimination, though I know of one that has like conflicting reports around it, where I know there were claims that like Big D wanted to quit the game, and that's why the votes were put on him to begin with. And it makes it a bit tough to really assess him as a player here, where outside that, I think he's a very competent player. I mean, it seemed like he was really the person in the middle of everything on the original Braun tribe, was kind of playing all sides, and was really the main decision maker on what was going on there. Again, not necessarily in a way that I would agree with, where I do think he probably flip-flopped a bit too much. But still, he definitely had a lot of influence there. And again, it just gets kind of sniped away at the swap, where he kind of inexplicably gets votes against him, which again isn't really explained on the show. And again, it seemed like part of that's because he did want to leave the game. And again, I do think that's a very tough thing to really gauge from his game. Where otherwise, I think there is definitely an argument that he should be higher on this list. But really, again, these wonky circumstances around him that makes him a bit tough to really land here. But I ended up landing him here at number 112. Now number 111. We're moving on to a player that made it much deeper into the game, but also one that, again, a bit unsure how exactly to rank this person. And that person is Michelle from Blood vs. Water, which is actually a pretty decent chunk up from her sister, which, again, I think on the offset, you might think that they would be very close together. Yeah, I do think Michelle actually played better than her sister in almost every single way. I mean, she's someone that seemed to be more integrated on her original tribe through her connection to Sandra, and she seemed to be a lot more in the action than Mel, who's just kind of seemingly on the outs for a lot of her original tribe dynamics. Now, post-swap, it's kind of similar in the fact that they were both on the bottom. But again, that's just due to kind of an lucky swap there. And then obviously, once we get to the merge, she is technically the last surviving member of her alliance before Purgatory happens, which again, that's at least something. Now, again, at the end of the day, I still don't think Michelle is a particularly good player, but she is kind of starting this like new tier of the list of players that did make it fairly deep, but players that are still very flawed. And I think she deserves to be this high because of how deep she made it, especially without some sort of twist helping her out along the way, though it also is a position where she didn't do that much actively right, especially towards the end of her game where she was just kind of a dead man walking from that point forward, though. Again, I think there's enough upside there in terms of longevity and, again, how involved she was early on to put her here at number 111. Number 110, we're moving on to a pretty actively bad player, one that made it very deep, though also was unable to gain any real traction in the game despite his constant attempts, and that player is Alex from Titans vs. Rebels. And Alex is a player that, again, I do think there's at least something to be commended here. The fact that he was trying so hard constantly in the game, the fact that he was always trying to make deals, trying to figure out his optimal play, and while, again, he failed a lot, I think there's something to be commended. The fact that he made it so deep while being on the bottom the entire time, while also, again, still being able to pull off a move here and there. Again, he was someone that obviously was on the offset from the very beginning, but then was able to get in with the likes of Ferris and Garrick and Raymond by the time of the swap, and then gets again swapped on the bottom, but once again is able to avoid being targeted there, while people like Rihanna and people like Sarah are targeted over him, and even along the way build a bond with Mark, and then he ends up swapping over to the other tribe eventually, to where he once again is able to get back in with Ferris and them. Now in the post-merge, he was, again, just kind of in and out of the majority at points. Though, again, I think at least recognized the fact that he was on the bottom and attempted to make a big play when Jaden ended up going home. And even in his boot round, I think was, again, at least fighting there to try to flip the votes onto Kirby and ultimately fails. But it's really a game of, again, a lot of downs, but there were some minor ups. Again, he was at least aware of his position in the game towards the end and was able to pull off a move. So while, again, still a pretty bad player, I think there's at least enough upside there to put him here at 110. Now 109, a player that is a similar thing, though probably doesn't have as many ups, also probably doesn't have as many downs as Alex, and that player is Robbie from Champs vs. Contenders. He also is kind of in and out of the majority throughout a lot of the game. He, again, is obviously working alongside the likes of Benji for most of the season, though, again, like Benji, his road early on is very tumultuous, where he's kind of just in and out of what's going on. Does have a pretty good relationship with the likes of Shawnee and Vanilla that keeps him around for a bit, though post-swap we do see him building a bond with Lydia, which does lead to him making an unquestionable choice in siding with the champions over the contenders coming into the merge, which is weird, and then also him being blindsided along Lydia when she's voted out, and then proceed to be taken out immediately after. Again, it's not great. It definitely is a very lacking game, though I do think there's less actively bad play from Robbie here than there is from Alex, where Alex is someone that was on the bottom the entire time. Robbie was someone that I think was just better positioned for more of the game. And while he doesn't necessarily have like a move that I think was, again, moderately impressive like Alex does towards the end of his run, it is his relative safety for a lot of season that makes me want to put him higher here at number 109. Now number 108, we're moving on to another player that was just in and out of the majority at points and was kind of riding along for the majority for a decent chunk of the game. And that player is Jaden from Titans vs. Rebels. And Jaden's just such a weird player because, like, I just do not know how intentional a lot of his game is. It really just feels like he was just there riding with the majority for a decent chunk of it, where it really just felt like he had a tie to Winna, who was more insulated in the group, though through that, again, he kind of just rides with the majority until the merge, to where at that point when Winna ends up going, he ends up just kind of flipping the Kirby for whatever reason, which, again, credit to Kirby, but also didn't really make much sense from Jaden's point of view, and really it's just leads him being a fairly easy person to eventually vote out, where we obviously see Raymond eventually flip to take him out, which, to be fair, is a fairly wonky circumstance that Raymond decides to make this like his move in taking out Jaden, which did feel like a weird move to make, though still a spot where, again, Jaden obviously didn't maintain his relationships well enough to survive that round. Again, he obviously burned a lot of his original tribe members, while also never having that great of a relationship with Raymond. Though, again, Jaden is someone that was seemingly a largely affable guy before that. Again, not really someone that was ever going to be targeted, just, again, due to be a physical presence, and also the fact that, again, people just liked him. And that's at least something, especially considering how deep into the game he made. Though, again, I do think he played the back portion of his game fairly suboptimally, especially considering how much he burned the people on the opposing side, where while I do think the vote that he gets taken out on is wonky in itself, I do think the path there was kind of self-inflicted. So, again, not a great player. but good enough to be here at 108. Now number 107, keeping with Titans vs. Rebels, though a very different player here. We're moving on to Rihanna. And Rihanna's someone here that is a very sloppy player. I mean, she's someone that definitely has like natural skills for the game. She had some decent one-on-one connections, particularly with Kirby. She was obviously very physical and did very well in challenges, while also was fairly well liked by most of her cast, though she was really just terrible strategically. Like, she would have very incorrect reads that led to her making some really bad decisions, led to her voting incorrectly at points where like people like Sarah would go home because of her, people like Jaden would go home because of her. Even when like Winna goes home, she was like tricked into voting the wrong way to her. Again, there's just like many points where like I just very much question like what exactly she's doing in the game. A lot of very questionable decision making there, but I do think she's a player that seems to be a solid all-around player. Like, obviously one that doesn't really have this like killer instinct to make it deep into the season, but one that made it fairly deep with some decent amount of win equity if she wasn't there against Ferris or Kirby. Now, really a major issue here, and really a lot of the reason why she's this low on the list, where I think there at least would have been an argument for her to at least crack the top 100. If it was not the case, is the fact that she was saved by Anonymous in episode 5, where that was a spot where it did seem like she was going to go, and through Anonymous, she ends up surviving past where she was meant to where, and if it wasn't for that, I probably would put her a little bit higher here. Yet ultimately, again, she's just a player that is just very sloppy, like very bad at making decisions in the game, and I think that's what makes her tough to really rank here. But again, I'm gonna have her here 107. Now number 106, moving on to a player that I actually initially thought would be lower until I really thought about it. I feel like, okay, maybe I was thinking of this person a bit too lowly, but either way, I do have Laura from Brains vs. Brawn, and Laura's a player here that, again, I was gonna put low because she was saved by an Anolim fairly early on. She also really spent a lot of the game just kind of scrapping on the bottom. Though I think there's some major upsides here from Laura. First, the fact that she was part of the initial majority. She was seemingly Joey's like right-hand man, and I think that's something to be commended. And obviously, again, that gets flipped on by the time of the merge, but again, she still had control for a decent amount of the early votes. And then after that, she gets swapped into a very bad position where she's on the bottom. But even then, she's the one to make it out of that over Georgia and Rachel. And something I kind of forgot about is that even in the spot where she was saved by Anonym, it was a very weird circumstance where Rachel had immunity and Georgia was out due to a sick day, to where I don't know how much to really fault Laura herself for that position. And then we get to the merge where, again, she does get saved by an idol at the merge, though, again, that was kind of a spot where like she was a safe vote. It's not like people like actively want her out of the game. And she's, again, at that point, like kind of like in and out of the majority at points. But she ultimately ends up going out with only one vote to her name, where obviously George ends up saving Kara with the secret idol. And I think that's a spot there where I think I will give Laura, again, some credit there, where, again, that definitely is a very wonky way for her to go, especially considering that was also a round where only a few people were even up for elimination, where, again, I think there's a lot of like unlucky circumstances revolving around Laura, to where there's also a lot of her just being on the bottom for a lot of the game. And again, she needs to be saved by an idol, non-limb, but again, there's so many wonky circumstances around everything around her game that I'm willing to like give her a little bit of grace here, put her a bit higher than what I was initially going to, which again put her here at number 106. Now number 105, on to a player that is tough to gauge because we never got to see much of this player, and again, they kind of leave unexpectedly, but I do have Chelsea from Brains vs. Brawn, and again, it's tough to gauge Chelsea because she was barely on the show, and also she gets medevac, so again, I don't know how to rank her, though again, she was alongside Danny for a lot of the season. Now, like Danny, she was in and out of the majority at points, where again, she was with the Simon grouping, who were in the minority during the early pre-merge phase, though after the swap, she ends up being in a better position, where they end up winning the battle over Shannon, but then after that, she flips against Simon, which felt like a misguided move, and then we get to the merge, where once again, it's just weird because they have the numbers, but they also don't because of Haley's idol, but even then, after that, they kind of maintain the numbers before she gets medevac, to where, again, it's just kind of all over the place, and again, I just don't know how much to attribute that to Chelsea. Now, again, the reason I'm putting Chelsea as high as she is because I do think there is a seemingly capable player in Chelsea. Like, she seems to be a pretty stable presence, someone that is well liked by her cast, and someone that, again, I don't know if she necessarily wins if she gets to the end, but someone that I think definitely has longevity on most given seasons, where, again, I do think when assessing her as a player, I do think she's on the same caliber as someone like Alora, someone like a Rihanna, but also her just, again, getting medevac to where we don't really have this, like, downfall for her. So, again, tough to rank her, but I did end up landing her at 105. Now, number 104, moving on to a similar case of a player that unexpectedly left the game, and we really just don't know what happened to him in the game. And at 104, I do have Ben from Brains vs. Brawn 2. And again, Ben really just ends up leaving the game out of the blue. It's not really explained. Obviously, there's stories out there what happened, but in terms of him in the game, he did very much seem like a okay player. I mean, obviously we didn't really get to see much of him, but from what we did see, he seemed to be running the tribe alongside Jesse, and in reality, we actually do see him doing a decent amount of the legwork there, even more so than Jesse at points, where Ben definitely felt like the more competent player between the two, though at the same time, him and Jesse were starting to get targeted by the time he left, where while Jesse was the bigger target of the two, and obviously, again, Jesse was the one that was going to get voted out over him. At the same time, it felt like Ben's game was on the downward slope, where even though he does survive over Jesse, it did not feel like he was poised to make a particularly deep run in the game, where it did feel like coming into the merge, he was going to be in the bottom. And again, it makes it very difficult to assess this game, as it's not like he was in a particularly great spot when he left the game. Though, again, I think he did demonstrate some skills in the game, was able to run some portions of the game. And I think we kind of know more about his game than Chelsea. While Chelsea was probably in a better spot at the time that she left the game, I do feel like Ben feels like the better player of the two. So again, I have him a bit higher here at 104. Now number 103, and now we're getting to some of the older players of Survivor all in a row here. Now ranked here due to kind of different reasons. So this is a player that I think can make it deep a lot of the time and is a very likable guy, but just very unlikely to win. And as two-time player Tarzan from AU 2017 and All-Stars. And again, Tarzan's just a weird figure here, as if we're just taking his first season into account, it's bad. Like, it's literally a spot where he idles himself out of the game. And again, obviously this gets propped up as this like big heroic moment, but it's also abhorrent gameplay. But despite that, it's like people wanted him to stay. Like, he was a pretty major swing vote, where despite him being on the outs, it's like the people in charge didn't actively want him to go. Though we do see his return for All-Stars, and I think that's probably just the way that we typically see his run go, which is essentially that he ends up being kind of a tag along to a majority group, gets dragged towards the end, and doesn't actually make it to the end. And again, I think that's the way that Tarzan's game goes most of the time, where again, I think he is a stable presence, he's a good ally, he's someone that will follow orders, but he's not someone that really has that gumption to go on to win the game. I think the only way he wins the game is if he gets to the end against someone that's really unlikable, and they just vote for Tarzan due to that, to where ultimately, again, Tarzan is just a player that is just a very stable player when he's not playing his idol on somebody that will lead to him getting out of the game. But again, it is that fact that also makes me put him lower here, where again, I think if it wasn't for that, he probably would be relatively high-ish on this list. Like, I mean, a decent ways into the top 100. Yeah, I think it's the fact that he also has his ability to self-sabotage and get himself voted out of the game, which is bad enough to put him here at 103. Now, number 102, essentially the same thing, though with a little bit more killer instinct. We have Kara from Brain Surgeon Brawn, and again, pretty much literally the same thing. Again, an older player that is a very good ally, is a ride or die for a certain player, but it also is willing to play their idol in a spot where it leads to them going home, which is just insane that this literally happens again. Now, I think a difference here with Kara is that we do see Kara have a little bit more of a killer instinct later in the game. Again, in comparison to Tarzan, who, again, I think would always just be blindly loyal. We do see Kara actually turn against George at the very end, at the Final Four, when it was him, and we see her, again, attempt to pull off a 2-1-1 against him, which, again, ends up being pulled on her. But, again, I think that at least shows this, like, level of a killer instinct for her, to where, while the rest of her game is, again, fairly lackluster, obviously a lot of blunders, like her accidentally voting out Big D. We have her meant to be taken out unanimously until George saves her from idol, which, to be fair, even then, that was, again, a wonky round to begin with. But again, there definitely were a lot of things across the season that are questionable, but she still was in the majority for a decent chunk of the season. I do think she showed a level of killer instinct at the end, and ultimately, I don't think she's that different of a player from Tarzan outside of showing that killer instinct. So for me, again, it's good enough to put her here at number 102. And now at 101, we're moving on to another older player Survivor, but one that demonstrated a lot of potential her first time and then didn't really as much the second time, but still, it's good enough to be at 101. And that player is Jackie from 2017 and All-Stars. And again, Jackie's so weird because I feel like my opinion of Jackie as a player is so radically different based on her two seasons, where, again, if this was solely based on 2017, I actually would have ranked her relatively high. Like, I do think Jackie's actually someone that seemed to have a lot of skills for the game, was, again, part of this, like, power duo alongside Henry that was really running her original tribe, and then really gets screwed over by Henry being an idiot and swapping tribes. And at that point, she's kind of screwed, just on the bottom and sniped out of the game. Though, obviously, we see a return for All-Stars, and that's not a great appearance from her. Despite her making it much deeper into the game, it really has her kind of turning into, like, a bit of a Tarzan figure, and the fact that she is kind of a lackey for the majority for a good chunk of the game. But then even then, by the end, ends up being a bit of a mess, where she ends up flipping her vote to take out Zach. She ends up playing the game very emotionally, seemingly. And and gets taken out immediately following that, where like the group she flipped to weren't willing to go to rocks for her, to where, again, it's a very weird game. I do think there are like polar opposite opinions of her from her two different appearances, to where ultimately, again, I think she ends up landing here above Kara and Tarzan, just because like I think her first appearance shows at least enough game ability there. Again, the fact that she was able to run her original tribe is at least something there that we don't really see from Tarzan or Kara, who are more like secondary characters, though again, her second appearance is much more in line with them. But I do think it's the fact that she at least had that strong first appearance, which makes her good enough to put her here at 101. But there we go. I mean, that is the next 50 players of my ranking of Australian Survivor. Again, that's it for part 2. Next up is part 3, so stay tuned for that at some point down the road. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.